Have you ever wanted to get published but you don't know where to start? Well, today on the Wizards of Eam, that's what Ben and I are going to talk about. What exactly we did and some tips for what you guys can do to get there. So to get started, we're going to be talking specifically about finding an agent, working with publishers, and then we'll dabble into self-promotion and stuff, but we think that we're going to save that for another episode. But before we, get going, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for listening to the Wizards of Eam and checking out the books that we do. All of your support has been great. And of course, thank you to everybody on Patreon, because you guys make it possible for Ben and I to do the live actual play, to do the Wizards of Eam podcast, and of course, to develop new material for the Land of Eam tabletop game. Let me set the stage a little bit. So we get the question, how do you get published, or what did you do to get published, all the time? I get it in email, social media, whatever. And a lot of times folks are asking, like, how do I submit my manuscript or my book to a publisher? And my first response is, well, you actually can't submit directly to a publisher, at least not a lot of the larger publishers. What you really need to do is find a literary agent. And that's what everything changed for Ben and I. Locating a literary agent and having an agent who can represent your work is key, because it's the agents that traditionally submit books to publishers for consideration. And where we started wasn't necessarily reaching out to agents, but we started with networking.
Yeah, and that begins with self-publishing. That begins with actually making, your book, your comic, and putting it out into the world. Well, we're talking about getting an agent and getting published, but there is like a lot of validity to self-publishing. It's essential, actually, to how we have gotten to where we are. We both worked on projects. I was putting out a graphic novel called Pong the Wandering Shaolin Monk, going to conventions, a bunch of conventions over several years, just 14 in a year at one time. And
it's so many conventions.
It was a lot of putting myself out there, which, if you know me, that's hard for me, but I recognized that it was essential to this whole process. And so
it's essential a couple of ways. It's not just meeting other people and making connections with their connections to find an agent, although that's really huge. It's also meeting other creators that are in a similar situation as you. They're producing their work, they're sharing it with the world, and they're navigating the complexity of getting it to that next level of being able to share it with the world. And there's a lot of camaraderie that is there that I really appreciate, where you get to encourage each other. And I think we may have talked about this in the past, but there's something to be said about working consecutively with another person, not just collaborating, but both working on creative projects and checking in with each other to hold each other accountable for making stuff. And that is like rife in the self-publishing world. And it's one of the magical elements of it for me.
And I think a lot of people make the mistake of sort of putting the really successful people on a pedestal and wanting to interact with them, when you should be interacting with the people on your level and making friendships and, collaborating with them.
Climbing that pyramid together.
Right.
You actually hear comics talk about this all the time. Like, we came up together. It's like, it comes up all the time. Any comedy podcast, we came up together. We were doing shows or whatever. Same thing with self-publishing in that early stage of publishing your work. Everybody's after the same goal, and you'd be surprised how much you can help each other by just talking, by checking in, by seeing what people are working on. And if you need resources, they may have them, or they may need resources from you and you may have them.
Even though that's a simple concept, it's not always this really direct line of success. There's a lot of winding roads that take you different places, and you just got to embrace it. So we'll tell you a bit about our road. It starts with the self-publishing and going to conventions and meeting people.
Best practices for how to go up the ladder if you're not self-publishing, or if you don't have that network.
Yeah. So along the way of this whole, self-publishing process, I met a pretty famous cartoonist now, Jason Shiga. I mean, back then he was way bigger than us, but I actually first met him at a Halloween party.
What were you dressed as at the Halloween party? That's a key element that I need to know.
I was dressed as Balky Bartakamus from Perfect Strangers.
I knew the answer to that.
And
but I just wanted to hear you say it on the stream.
Jason was dressed as nothing, but he was wearing like a sweater, and we kind of decided together that he should be Larry Appleton. And so that kind of struck up a little friendship, and we'd see each other later at conventions and sort of, talk to each other every time. And then I started drawing at his house every month. So that kind of grew friendship there. And that's just one example of the different types of friendships you grow by putting yourself out there networking.
Yeah, you'd be surprised what happens organically and how low stakes it is to get to know people and chat about things that you mutually love.
And I really want to stress that, like, there are no shortcuts. I was making comics for a long time and doing the work and self-publishing, and got a Xeric grant, and I did a Kickstarter back in the early days of Kickstarter. And then I asked Jason, he's the only cartoonist I know who has an agent. Like, James and I were looking to get Rickety Stitch off the ground, and self-publishing, we realized, was just super hard, rewarding, but super hard. And so just by asking Jason, he kind of hooked us up with his agent, and we got a conversation going. Obviously, that was no guarantee that anything was going to happen. We still had to pitch.
Yeah, and I want to stress that. We still had to go through the same process of seeing if we were a good fit for the agent, and the agent liking the work and seeing if we were a good fit for them. And for us, it just happened to work out that way. It was like, it was a well-made match, and thank you, Jason.
Yeah, we're forever indebted to Jason Shiga. And if you haven't checked out Jason Shiga's work, definitely check out Meanwhile Demon and his new book, Samurai versus Ninja, which are these, Meanwhile and Samurai versus Ninja are these amazing choose your own adventure comics. So
impressive stuff. In fact, he's won an Eisner Award. So Jason is
he's like swimming in awards. He's an amazing cartoonist.
Yes.
He's like a luminary.
Right.
So that is our path. And it was a circuitous path of just making friends and, being open to new experiences. But there is a more traditional path.
There is, and it's one that I have experience with. If you're not going to shows, because I wasn't going to shows. I went to shows, but I wasn't going to as many as Ben, for sure. And so I, at the same time, I was publishing a lot of short stories with different literary magazines and stuff. And I was working for a company writing graphic novel scripts. And I was simultaneously working on novels that were young adult and middle grade, which I've since gone by the wayside because all those ideas have been wrapped up into the Land of Beam. But I needed to find an agent for myself, and I wanted to go through the experience. And I was in a writer's group at the time with another author who had written, his name is Mike Sirota, and he wrote The Bicycle Thief, which I always see like in random bookstores. I recently bought a copy of it. I found it in a recycled bookstore to support Mike. But he walked me through how he got an agent and how he went through the process. And the basic process is you do a Google search. You search for literary agencies or agents. It's very simple. You'll come up with all kinds of resources that show you, here's the agent, here's who they are, here's the agency they represent. And then you look at all the different agents and you start to see what they represent as clients. I'm comparing my fantasy novel story to the other authors that this agent represents. And if it feels like it's within the same realm of possibility of being able to pitch to the agent, then you know that agent's on your target list. So I created this big list of agents. There's like dozens and dozens of them. And I drafted out a query letter and I put together a sample of my novel. I had written the novel, which is also important. The entire novel was complete so that the agent would be able to determine, one, if they liked the story, and two, if I had the chops to actually complete the novel, not just come to them with an idea. And so I gave them a sample chapter. I wrote the query letter. I started hearing back from probably half a dozen agents whose names I can't even remember now, and I feel bad, but half a dozen agents. And I got to various different stages where they would read the whole manuscript, and I would get rejections, or I'd get, hey, can you send me a little bit more? Or, hey, would you be able to tweak the story XYZ? Things that Ben and I are now super familiar with when we're talking to agents and editors. But I never secured an agent because by the time, simultaneously, Ben and I were introduced to our agent through Jason. But that process was something that was taught to me by another author, and have seen many authors use the same process for how they got their start with a literary agent and got their careers off the ground.
And there are a couple things you want to think about. So when you're doing your research, you want to actually know the market of your, like the current industry market. What books are out there? Where does your book fit in? Where would it fit into the market? because agents and editors want to know that. They don't always know right off the bat, and they want to know what you think.
So that they feel comfortable with who their editorial contacts are who will buy the manuscript. It's that simple. They want to know if it'll sell.
Yes. And when you're an artist or writer, sometimes this can feel anti-art in a way, like putting it in those business terms, but it's super essential to actually securing an agent and an editor. You have to have an idea of where your book fits and who your book is for. Like, who do you imagine reading it? Is this a YA book? Is this a middle grade book? If you have no idea, then they probably will have no idea. It needs to have a strong identity.
I want to thumbs up that, because if you don't know where your book fits, they're not going to do the work to figure it out for you, because they're not.
We actually ran into a problem with this with Rickety Stitch.
Yep.
Because Rickety Stitch is super bright, colorful. It looks like a kid's book, but when you start reading it, there's some darker themes. There's some maybe older humor. And so it was classified as YA. However, James and I kind of feel like if we had maybe tweaked some things, we could have maybe positioned it better. And, what happened was Rickety Stitch got amazing reviews through trades such as Kirkus and
Publishers Weekly,
Library Journal. And yet it kind of struggled to find its place in Barnes and Noble.
Yeah. And in fact, literally struggled to find its place, because we would find it in young adult fantasy, even though it's a graphic novel series. So it would be sitting next to the Mortal Instruments and books and things that it really didn't fit with.
And James and I feel that was true because we just made something that we thought was going to be awesome, which is what you should do. But it helps when you fine tune that and know exactly who you want your audience to be. That whole experience directly influenced how we approached Dungeoneer Adventures, because we're like, all right, we're going to do a middle grade series. We know exactly who's going to read this, where it's going to go. And Dungeoneer Adventures did sell much better than Rickety Stitch.
Yes. And it was easy for our agent to understand its place. So doing your research is really critical to finding an agent and getting published.
Actually pitching an editor to a publisher is pretty similar to pitching an agent.
Crafting the pitch to the editor can be a little bit different. But the benefit of having an agent is that the agent will help you get into the psyche of the editor, so that when you're presenting the hook for your story, when you're presenting the outline or the summary of your story, then they'll be able to clearly understand where you intend to go with the story. And it's especially important if it's a series, the full arc, not just the individual story. So I'm going to dig in on this just a little bit because, for example, Dungeoneer Adventures, it's a 3-book series. We needed each book to be as self-contained as possible so that if you pick it up, you get a great story. We had to figure out the strategy for weaving that bigger story into the shorter stories. And the editor wants to see that.
I think it's important to boil down the essence of your story into a pithy pitch line, like a couple lines that really sells what your book is. And if you can't do that, there might be a problem with the story. Like you might need to refine some things.
Clearly communicate what your story is and why it's exciting in as short of time as possible with as few words as possible. A good example that kind of caught fire is with Land of Eam. The Lord of the Rings meets the Muppets. I get it. I understand the tone. Now, does it pay it off? That's our job. It either will or it won't, but I think it did. It's Muppety in Lord of the Rings. So I don't know.
Yeah, of course. And Rickety Stitch, a skeleton bard who is on a quest to discover who he was when he was alive. It's just an interesting, weird concept. Who he was.
It's an interesting and a weird
concept.
Mean? Yeah.
So you've got that. And if you are pitching a book with art, such as a graphic novel or a middle grade series with art, we can't stress that you should definitely have the art in the pitch. And we speak from experience because recently James and I did pitch something without art.
We regret it. We feel like it didn't do the story justice. And we won't make that mistake again. But every day we're learning,
And the reason is, I've talked to other people about this. The reason is the people that you're pitching to, you don't want to leave it up to their imagination. You want the vision to be completely clear. And when a project does have art, I mean, the art is important. There's a reason there's art. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Right. It represents more than just proving that you can execute what you promised. it's so much of the soul of the story is wrapped up into that art. Dungeoneer Adventures would be nothing without all of the elements of the art that present the different experiences of the characters, the emotes that are not in the text, but you see in a totally different way, because comics are a completely different way to tell a story than a book or a film. It's like a snapshot of what all of those different emotions could potentially mean.
So for a graphic novel, I think the baseline is about 15 to 20 pages of finished art. And that doesn't necessarily need to be the beginning. It just needs to be the most exciting portion of the story. You could do more. I've also heard that editors don't want to see the whole thing because they want to, change things, and comics are such that it's harder to change. And when we're pitching something like this, Dungeoneer Adventures, I did the art for the first 2 chapters completely. And then throughout the rest of the book, I was doing like big splash pages and stuff to really sell the action and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The high points where there's like, whoa, see what this can be. It's not just, the kitschy fart joke.
Yeah. And we got smarts.
We got farts and we got heart. Okay.
Farts and smarts and hearts. There's obviously more to this process that we can get into in other videos, like James hinted at, the actual promotion and marketing of a book once it's in the publisher's hand. But this, I think, encapsulates the steps that you can take to start getting your books published. But nothing replaces actually writing, actually making the work. None of these tips will help you in that regard. You just got to have that drive.
Right. This all assumes that you've got the drive and the dedication to actually write your book or draw your comic. Those things you must do. The rest of it is pretty mechanical. And don't be discouraged. Like I pitched to, probably like 30 or 40 agents before I started really hearing back from people. And it can take a lot of time. And publishing a book, especially selling and then getting it published, can take years. It can take a couple of years. For Ben and I, it took 10 years plus to get Rickety Stitch published. Now, we hope that not everybody takes that long, but for us, it was excellent because it was this huge learning experience that got us to this point and gave us the tools that we needed to navigate the publishing industry. And in terms of the gaming industry, for like talking about getting a game published, the process was very, very similar for us.
It started with us making something, putting it out there, meeting people.
That's right. So I think that's it for today. I think we covered pretty much everything. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave comments or to ping us in the podcast. I think there's like a little, you can like text us thing.
Like, subscribe, okay? Ring that bell.
Do people still say that? Ring that bell? Everybody
You can ring that bell.
Wow. Will do. Will do. All right. Well, thanks. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.